Okay, so hello guys. Today we will be covering Unit 4, Unit 5, and Unit 6, which is Period 2 of the LEQ periods. And basically, this covers from 1800 to about 1877, I think. Let me get my packets. Yeah, okay. To 1898. So that's about like 100 years or so. And we'll start with period 4. So period 4 is from 1800 to 1848. So when you think 1800, you want to think the revolution of 1800, which is the transfer of power, first successful peaceful transfer of power between two different political parties. So in the election of 1800, you have Thomas Jefferson tying with Aaron Burr, who was running as his vice president, but they tied, and they were both Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson only got the presidency after Hamilton personally endorsed him and was like, okay, you guys should vote Jefferson. And he endorsed him over Burr, which later led to the Hamilton-Burr duel. But this crisis basically led to Congress adopting the 12th Amendment, which said that you had to put separate ballots for the president and vice president, so the crisis would not happen again. And Jefferson was a guy that was super agrarian. So he loved like farmers. He loved like his vision of America was a very agrarian society made up of independent yeoman farmers that just doing their own thing and farming, not very manufacturing, not industrial like Hamilton. He just wants people to be small scale, predominantly agricultural farmers. And his vision aligned with small scale federal governments, and he believed that the masses could basically govern themselves. Like, you don't need a big federal government to govern, they can essentially govern themselves on like a local or smaller level. So, but actually, what he did, like his policies, some of his policies actually enlarged the federal power more than ever before. So one big thing he did, or actually, let me talk about what happened in 1800. So, in 1800, Gabriel's rebellion occurred, and basically this was one of America's first large-scale slave uprisings. So basically, an enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel, he was in Virginia, and he and his co-conspirators intended to have a violent display of protest at the Capitol until their demands for abolition were met. But the plot was discovered, and they were all killed. Him and like 25 other slaves, they were hung because the plot was discovered. And in response, Virginia made the laws concerning slaves even much more harsher because they were afraid of another slave uprising. And they made it so that you can't even meet, or slaves cannot even meet in groups unless they were supervised by white people. And it became way harder for people to legally free slaves. So that happened in 1800. And another big thing that happened in 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson. So basically, Napoleon, he was the king of France, and he sold this huge chunk of land to America, which doubled the U.S. For $15 million. So that's such a bargain. But basically, Napoleon was eager to sell the territory mainly because he was fighting a bunch of wars in Europe called the Napoleonic Wars, and he needed money to fund his campaign, but also because the Haiti Revolution, which was led by Toussaint Louverture, that kind of turned France off to colonies. And what's interesting is that the same Jeffersonians that really, they were super proud of the French for uprising and having their own revolution, and they supported the French Revolution. Those same people were repulsed by the Haitian Revolution just because it was slaves uprising. And the Haitian Revolution was the first successful slave uprising in a French colony called Saint-Domingue. And it really reinforced America's fear of slave uprisings because this was the first really successful one. But basically, the Louisiana Purchase went against Jefferson's strict constructionism. So basically, what Jefferson believes is that the Constitution, you should read it like word for word, like interpret it literally. And nowhere in the Constitution does the president have the power to buy land. But Jefferson authorized the purchase anyways. Well, actually, who bought the Louisiana Purchase? He sent, I think it was like James Monroe over, and James Monroe bought it anyways. And this really struggled, this made Jefferson struggle with his consciousness because he wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and this went very against his ideals. But he bought it anyways and justified it by saying that if they got this much more land, it furthers his vision of an agrarian republic where there's a lot of little farmers, because more land gives more land to like white farmers who can then use that to create a small farm and truly become independent, virtuous, and free. And to map this territory out, he sent the Corps of Discovery, led by Lewis and Clark, to explore the north part, and then Zebulon Pike explored the south part. In 1807, there was the Embargo Act, which was under Jefferson again, and this was meant to punish Britain for impressing American sailors. So impressment basically means British people would take American sailors and force them onto their ships and force them to fight for British in a war. And this was kind of acceptable when America was still a colony under Britain, because okay, we're British, it's kind of fine, I guess. It was annoying but acceptable. But now that America had declared its independence, it was not okay. So Jefferson did the Embargo Act of 1807. And this is a famous political cartoon that symbolizes it. It's like, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me, which is an embargo spelled backwards, and basically shows like a snapping turtle. And basically, the Embargo Act really hurt American economy because it prevented any American ships from sailing to foreign ports. And this devastated the American economy, and it actually spurred American manufacturing, because now that people couldn't import goods or manufacture goods from foreign nations, they had to learn how to create themselves. So this spurred domestic factory development and manufacturing development, which was exactly the opposite of what Jefferson wants. Remember, Jefferson wants a very agricultural, agrarian society, and this does not support that. And it also dropped exports by 80%. So this really hurt the American economy. So this was replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Basically, the Non-Intercourse of 1809 reopened with trade with all foreign nations except Britain and France. So it was just like, okay, we'll trade with everyone but Britain and France. And this kind of helped, but the main trade was already from Britain and France, so it didn't do as much. So this was then replaced by Macon's Bill number 2, which was like, okay, like we will open trade with whichever nation, Britain or France, that respects America's neutrality and like respects that we're a separate country first. And France was like, okay, like we accept that, but they didn't really do anything. Like they still impressed us, and they still blockaded, or they still did stuff to us that didn't respect their neutrality, even though they said they would. So yeah. So that was Macon's Bill number 2 in 1810. And then after this, all this kind of British impressment, like the need for America to really assert their neutrality, and that the fact that they're like their own nation and defending their national honor. And also, British forts were found on U.S. soil, even though they were supposed to be taken away after the American Revolution. They were still there. And also, the British were supplying arms to Native Americans, which on the frontier, like Tecumseh and other natives, they were being supported by the British. And this really angered the United States, because you're giving tools and stuff to our enemies, the Native American enemies. And also, warhawks in Congress like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, they really wanted war. They wanted to call for war to uphold the principle of free trade. They wanted to liberate the U.S. from any European infringements or entanglements. And they also really wanted to annex Canada. And ultimately, we won the War of 1812, which increased nationalism. But first, there was a Hartford Convention in 1814. So in the Hartford Convention, some New England Federalists met, and they were like, oh, we strongly hate this war. Like, we should not be going to war with Britain. And they basically discussed their waning relevance and influence in national politics. And they called for a removal of the 3/5 clause that strengthened the Southern federal power. And they said that New England should secede from the Union, and they really opposed this War of 1812. And because we actually won the War of 1812, that led to increased nationalism, because even though we didn't win the war, technically, we didn't lose it either. So, and that was another big nationalism, like, wow, like, we did that, guys. And America's ego got boosted a little bit more because they didn't lose to Britain once again. And the Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812. It was in 1814, and it didn't really do anything. Like, it effectively did nothing, but it increased nationalism. There was, like, no territorial changes at all. Like, we didn't gain anything. It was just kind of nothing happened. But the British did withdraw some of their forces from the Northwest Territory. And also Andrew Jackson, who would later become our 7th president, he fought a glorious battle at the Battle of New Orleans weeks after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Like, the war was over, but he didn't know yet, so he just fought it. And he won. And his victory convinced America, that the people, that there was a divine hand that oversaw America's identity and that they should westward expand. And also his victory, Jackson's victory in the war, would become a major part of his political campaign strategy later. And also before that, there was a Barbary War. So this is another part of America's neutrality, or like interactions with foreign powers. So the Barbary Wars, basically the U.S. was paying some pirates in Tripoli to protect their trade and like don't bomb it and stuff. But when Jefferson took office, he was like, oh, we're not paying you these things so you can protect us. Like, he took away the payments. He stopped the payments. He ended the policy of paying tributes to the Barbary pirates of North Africa in exchange for protection, and this caused the pirates to attack American ships, and Jefferson was forced to assemble a military just in case to fight. But later, Jefferson's administration negotiated a reduced payment to the pirates instead, but his navy would later prove useful in the War of 1812, which we just talked about. So after the War of 1812, and after you saw the Federalists heavily oppose the War of 1812, and when we won it, they looked like they were out of touch and they didn't know the new American reality. So after that emerged the era of good feelings, which is when only one political party functions at the national level. So it basically emerges after the death of the Federalist Party, and it encapsulates a supposedly unshakable dominance of the Democratic Party. And President James Monroe won the elections of 1816 and 1820 because in both cases he was running without major opposition, and he was Democratic Republican. So the era of good feelings also brought about feelings of sectionalism, which is loyalty to one's nation, and nationalism, which is loyalty to one's nation. Sectionalism is loyalty to one's region. And because of a common language, common culture, ethnicity, religion, and shared history. The battle between sectionalism and nationalism dominated politics and the Supreme Court this period. In 1817, we have the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which basically disarmed, like, it was the Great Lakes disarmament between Britain and the U.S., which possibly avoided war. We also have the Talmadge Amendment in 1819. Basically, Missouri applied for statehood, and it was filled with slaves. And James Talmadge was like, he added to the application that Missouri would enter as a free state. Like, the amendment prohibited the further introduction of slaves in the area, and also required slaves to be emancipated before the age of 25. So basically, it got rid of slavery in Missouri, and this was a very Congress-splitting issue, and it really like brought slavery to the forefront of national like concern, and because the largest concern at the time was maintaining the balance of 11 free states and 11 slave states. But thankfully, the Compromise of 1820, also known as the Missouri Compromise, negotiated by the great compromiser Henry Clay. This admitted Missouri as a slave state and broke off like from Massachusetts, Maine as a free state, and basically the southern border of Missouri, which was the 3630 line, everything below it could have slavery, and everything above it would prohibit slavery. So, and then Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. So John Quincy Adams bought Florida from Spain, which is over here, and he basically established a clear border between U.S. and New Spain. So that was, again, like interactions and relations with foreign powers, like fighting, getting, and acquiring new territory as well. And then after several Latin American countries seized independence from Spain, President Monroe took the opportunity to declare the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically like we, the U.S., are dominant in the Western Hemisphere. So basically they were like, yeah, I was like, this is a good picture. So they were like, oh, like the U.S. dominates the entire Western Hemisphere. Europe, you should not entangle, you should not come in our affairs. You should not try to involve yourself. And it said that the U.S. would abstain from involvement in Europe, and Europe should not interfere with the new states of Latin America. So basically, Monroe was like, the Western Hemisphere is closed off to further colonization. Like, it's all the U.S. is. And we probably didn't have the military power to back this claim, but thankfully no one challenged it. The Panic of 1819 was the first major recession in American history. 1819. And basically it was caused by a bunch of irresponsible small-scale and national-level banking practices, and also decreased European demand for southern exports like cotton. And working men were hit the hardest by this. So they really wanted to hold politicians accountable. And to do this, they had to vote, right? But they were unable to vote because working men were poor. And right now there are property qualifications. You need to have like property in order to vote. So because so many working men wanted to vote, by 1825, most eastern states had reduced their property requirements for voting, which led to really an influx of, or an increased pool of voters. So this caused the Democratic Party to split into two different parties, which is the National Republicans and the Democrats. So the National Republicans were like Federalists. They had an expansive view of federal power. They wanted a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Democrats were a restrictive view of federal power, like Jefferson, like small agrarian, strict constructionism. They wanted to limit the power of the federal government. And then John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay were National Republicans and later became Whigs, and Andrew Jackson was a Democrat. So in the election of 1824, John Quincy Adams was elected president, even though Andrew Jackson got the popular vote. But since there were too many electoral candidates, no one could get the electoral majority. So the decision was tossed to the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. And then John Quincy Adams later made him the Secretary of State. And Jackson and his supporters called this the corrupt bargain, even though it wasn't necessarily a corrupt bargain. Like, it wasn't actually planned out beforehand, I think. But yeah. And Adams strongly supported Clay's American system. So the American system there are like three tenets of the American system, which is basically internal improvements, like federally funded internal improvements, protective tariffs to fund the internal improvements and to really like protect manufacturing, and also chartering of a national bank. I think second bank of the United States that would be able to provide credit. I think, second bus. So yeah, that's what Adams supported. That was really favoring the Hamilton School of Economics. But yeah, that was the election of 1824, and that was Adams' administration. And then in 1828, Andrew Jackson became the 7th president. So Andrew Jackson brought about the age of Jackson, but yeah. Andrew Jackson was a Democrat. His original support rested on his military victories in the War of 1812, as I said before, like the New Orleans War, and also his hands-on self-promotion. So while other candidates were just like sitting at home and having their campaign teams kind of promote for them, Andrew Jackson was really out there with the people like promoting. And he really applied the law of marketing to elections, because now there's like a democratic base, like there's a common people. You have to go out and market yourself. Like, it's as important, selling your image is as important as selling or communicating your political stances. So this was more, his election was, he really catered towards the common man, the common person, and that brought about the age of Jackson. So Jackson believed that states should be the focal point of the government activity, and he opposed any federal efforts to shape the economy or people's lives. And then, as one of John Quincy Adams' last acts in office, he passed the Tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations, to the South. So, Tariff of Abominations. The South hated this because they thought it benefited the North unequally, because this would really boost Northern industry, because now it makes foreign imports more expensive, so the South has to buy from the North, which boosts the Northern economy, but the South is poor. Like, they're not poor, but now like they're forced to support the North, but they have to pay higher prices. So It angered Southerners who relied on imported manufactured goods. And Jackson renewed this tariff in 1832, and his vice president, John C. Calhoun, who basically shared South Carolinian sympathies, or basically the South, and he hated the tariff. So he developed the doctrine of nullification in his South Carolina expedition and protest, and this sprouted the nullification crisis of 1832. So basically, I don't really have a good picture, I guess. But nullification crisis. So South Carolina decided to nullify the tariff in its nullification doctrine of 1833, and they really drew from the 1798 Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were based on the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they wanted to collect the. So also they said that if federal authorities wanted to collect the tax, South Carolina threatened to secede. So in response, Jackson was really angry and he persuaded Congress to pass the Force Act, which gave him authority to use federal troops to enforce federal laws in South Carolina. So basically, he would station a military in South Carolina and really enforce it. And South Carolina nullified the Force Bill, but they later relented when Congress passed the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which lowered the taxes. So that was a first nullification crisis, kind of emphasized regional sectional tensions. And then Jackson also hated the Second Bank of the U.S. So he saw it as a hydra, an 8-headed monster. And he believed that it favored tycoons over the common people, and Jackson was really for the common people. And without a central institution to control any federal funds, and Jackson vetoed the Second Bank's charter, so there was no charter. All the federal funds went into the hands of small pet banks, which were politically and personally friendly to Jackson. So these small banks started to print. They're also called wildcat banks. They just started to print increasingly large amounts of paper money, which caused inflation and also 6-year-long depression that was made worse by falling cotton prices and speculation in land, canals, and railroads. And Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, was left to deal with this. But yeah, to combat this, Jackson administration issued the Specie Circular of 1836, which declared that it would only accept gold and silver as payment for public land. But yeah, Martin Van Buren would inherit this economic crisis that Jackson caused. And then Jackson also implemented the spoil system. So the spoil system was basically in exchange for federal support, where we can give you jobs. So basically, the winner of the election has the right to, or it's also called patronage, but the winner of the election gives civil service jobs to supporters, friends, and relatives as a reward for working toward victory and incentive for continued party loyalty. So this system is the opposite of the merit system. And yeah, Jefferson basically expressed his belief in equality, and he believed that the right to vote should not be in the exclusive position of a privileged class. And he also removed, this statement justified the removal of 10% of his federal office holders to make room for his own supporters. Okay, so after Jackson, there's William Henry Harrison, who's elected president in 1840. He was a Whig, and Whigs were basically the party that came after Jackson. They were formed solely because they hated Jackson. They were very economically nationalistic, so the government should be active in building infrastructure to support big businesses. They got support from the middle class for business and industry. They promoted protective tariffs, basically like Henry Clay's American Plan. While the Democrats were more economically laissez-faire, hands-off. The government doesn't really regulate businesses, kind of leaves it alone. Yeah. So William Henry Harrison was a Whig. Again, his success was mainly from the he was another war hero. Yeah. So basically, Tecumseh, a Native American leader of the Shawnee tribe, he tried to unite all natives into a confederation to resist white encroachment. And His beliefs made him dangerous to the American government, so he was murdered at the Battle of Thames by William Henry Harrison, and this was used as Harrison's campaign policy. So from this, we can draw a lot of parallels from Jackson's campaign, where he was like a war hero, and William Henry Harrison's campaign, where he was also a war hero in a way. And after William Henry Harrison died a month after in office, John Tyler, his vice president, assumed the position, and he was called His Excellency because this was the first time a vice president had to assume power after the president died in office. But yeah, the Whig majority tried enacting the American system, but Tyler vetoed it because even though he ran as a Whig, he was more Democrat. And the Whigs were furious by this and took out their support behind the presidency. And John Tyler's single term was basically gridlocked and devoid of accomplishment, which showed how central political parties were to backing like a president and how essentially they had become to American government. Because like they hadn't without party support, William Henry Harrison John Tyler couldn't do anything. Oh, also one thing of Jackson's administration that I forgot to mention was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So basically this provided the funds for relocating the 5 civilized tribes, which were the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. So after Georgia attempted to forcefully remove the Cherokee, in Trail of Tears. That's a sneak peek of where we're going. But after Georgia tried to remove the Cherokees forcefully from their land, the Cherokee Nation challenged the act in the Supreme Court. And in a case called Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, they ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign nation and that Georgia did not have the right to conduct state law within their premises, and only the federal government could have like treaties with them. But later in 1835, the U.S. and a small delegation from like the Cherokee tribe, they signed the Treaty of New Echota, and that basically exchanged Cherokee land for a reservation territory west of the Mississippi River. And the Cherokees who did not relocate before 1838 did so forcibly on the Trail of Tears, where more than 4,000 of the 15,000 were forced to migrate westward died. So basically Jackson's entire reign, he definitely increased the power of the executive branch because he heavily used vetoes. And for that, his opponents called him King Andrew Jackson, because you can see like he's stepping on the Constitution. He's really using the power of veto to, like, he vetoed the National Bank. He vetoed a bunch of other things. He literally ignored the Supreme Court decision in removing the Indians, and he developed the executive branch and gave the position of president much more power than it previously had with trigger-happy vetoes. Yeah, so let me see. So, okay. Another big thing of Unit 4 is Industrial and Market Revolution. So, Industrial and Market Revolution. Basically, the Industrial Market Revolution was a connecting of, the American Yawp. Anyways, yeah, it was a connection of, it was a transition from a producer culture to consumer culture. So, it happened mainly in the 1820s to 1850s. And the market revolution is the connecting of the northern and southern industries promoted by developments in agricultural, like technology, communication, etc. The industrial revolution and market revolution correspond with each other, and they correspond with the industrial revolution in the U.S. and Western Europe. So the 3 primary causes were rapid improvement in tech and inventions, production of goods for a cash market instead of like shifting from subsistence farming, and transportation and communication improvements. So the Industrial Revolution shifted production away from handcrafted artisanal pieces to mass-produced machine-made goods in Europe and America. And we see this in interchangeable parts, which were invented by Eli Whitney and produced in great quantities. Basically, interchangeable parts are kind of exactly what they sound like. Basically, a machine like makes these like parts. Oh, you know what would be cool if I had a whiteboard that I could draw on? Whiteboard, draw. Um, Sorry, this is a little. Okay, I don't even really need this, but basically, interchangeable parts is like instead of creating the whole gun from scratch, um, from you now like one by one, you now make the pieces of the gun. So like this. You all make like many of them, like you mass produce them, and then you have unskilled laborers basically assemble them. And these people would assemble them. This would lead to the factory line later on in period 6 about. But this allowed for mass production because like everyone, it allows pieces that could be to be assembled separately and mass produced by machines, and unskilled laborers would assemble these parts separately into manufactured products such as muskets, farming equipment, and household utensils. And this system spawned the American system of manufacturing. So the market revolution was specific to the US, and as I said before, it basically linked the northern and southern economies. Okay, that's not really the relative positions. It basically linked the northern and southern economies, so like northern and southern economies by like railroads, not by railroads, by advancements in tech industry, agriculture, communication, transportation. We have the canal, we have the canal, we have the steamboat, we have the telegraph, we have the railroad, which is a big one, the railroad. And these basically opened new land for settlement, which made it easier for economic enterprises to sell their products. 5. And link farmers to both national and world markets. So they're really like global now, kind of. And by 1860, there were more than 30,000 railroad tracks in the U.S. And they're concentrated mostly in the north. So there's a lot of railroad stuff in the north. And the south doesn't really need that because they have deep, lazy rivers that they can just transport to like the ocean. But the north really needs these canals, which are just man-made rivers, to really like facilitate trade because they have very shallow rivers. So the Erie Canal is a big canal. Erie Canal completed in 1825. It connected the Great Lakes, which were over here, to the Atlantic Ocean. And no, it was more like New York, across New York, like that. And the Great Lakes were over here. And basically, it made New York City the nation's largest port. We also have the invention of Robert Fulton's steamboat, which allowed goods to travel both upstream and downstream, because previously you could only go the direction the water is going, right? And then textile machinery, like Eli Whitney's cotton gin. So again, Eli Whitney created cotton gin, which easily separates the seed from the cotton ball. James Hargreaves spinning jenny, which again like textile machinery and the water frame. They've all helped the growth of the cotton textile industry. So as northern textile mills boomed, the demand for southern cotton swelled as well, and American slavery accelerated. So in the South, they're picking like the cotton, like this is cotton, for example. They're picking it. Well, the slaves are picking it. So it's very heavy slave labor. There's huge plantations working this, and then they send all this stuff to the north, which has these like textile mills that really just work and produce this southern cotton to very cheap cotton, very cheap cloth and textiles. And this basically accelerates the demand for slavery because you need more cotton. And even though the North isn't directly like having slaves with like big plantations, they really encourage slavery because of the growth of these huge northern textile mills. And immigrants mostly worked in these factories, so you have like German and Irish immigrants, mostly German because there was a failed revolution of the nation states and displaced farmers came, and then Irish because there was a potato famine going on. So these immigrants really supplied the cheap labor in these in the northern textile mills. So as factory businesses expanded, there was a growing middle class of owners, managers, and entrepreneurs, which are often referred to as industrial capitalists. So the market revolution strengthened the size and wealth of the middle class, And obviously, the profit-driven modern industry, like we have to make profit, we have to make profit. That really went against the common, like the working class who just wanted like good pay and like reasonable working hours. And they were facing low wages and long hours, like 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. And during this time, the cult of domesticity also came. So that was like the separate sexual division of labor. This idea that a woman's identity and purpose revolved around child rearing and making her home a safe rest for her husband. So that created private and public spheres, and each gender was relegated to each. So private was women and public was men, and men were seen as wage earners and women were seen as homemakers. And then slavery, again, Cotton Kingdom of the South and manufacturing behemoth of the North were interdependent on slavery. So, and increasingly, wage slavery people, like, they did not begin to see, like, before they saw slavery as a necessary evil, but increasingly they began to see it as a positive good. John C. Calhoun argued that slave labor saved the whites in the North from the wage slavery of the North. Saved the whites of the South from the wage slavery of the North. And they also did paternalism, which is basically like, oh, we took away the slaves' rights because it's for their own good. And this allowed the white people to think of themselves as benevolent and kind owners. Another big thing during this period was the Second Great Awakening. So this peaked around the 1820s and 1830s, and like the First Great Awakening, was a reaction to Enlightenment thought. The Second Great Awakening was a reaction to the Market Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So this was a series of religious revivals among the lower class of Protestants that emphasized really religious living, personal restraint, and a moral rectitude that would lead individuals and society to salvation. So basically, like, reform society. And this actually spurred a bunch of reform movements. But Charles Grandison Finney was one of the leading Second Great Awakening ministers. He was a leading evangelical minister, and he basically emphasized that just like in the Industrial Revolution, economic success is in the hands of the individual. In the Second Great Awakening, salvation is in the sinner's hands. And both emphasized the key to success was hard work. And the Second Great Awakening was spurred by a rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, which promoted a greater sense of morality in society. And preachers urged citizens to become responsible for what's happening in their societies. And while the Market Revolution promoted like a sense of immorality or a culture of immorality, like profit-driven immorality, the Second Great Awakening awakened citizens saw it as their right to reform the ills in society and really confront those evils and create a solution. So Second Great Awakening meetings were very egalitarian. So what that means is that they were attended by a lot of different people, like African Americans, white people, free people, enslaved people, women. And it was also influenced by rejection of rationalism, which is the thinky part, over a rejection of rationalism. So emotion over reason. So and then it spread rapidly throughout America thanks to the emotional speeches of Methodist and Baptist preachers. Oh God, this is already one period. Okay. So a lot of reform movements happened. You have education, you have horseman, the growth of middle class afforded families a comfortable home, transportation, clothing. Increasingly, women had the time to stress the power of education. Horseman, who is the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, he advocated for the construction of better schools, longer terms, expanded curriculum, and Noah Webster basically created a standardized dictionary which promoted standardized American language, and also his textbooks promoted patriotism. He was known as a schoolmaster of the Republic. Abolition movement also happened, and that basically gained a voice through the creation of church-based organizations that believed slavery was contrary to the teachings of Christianity, also the principles in the Declaration of Independence. Many of them were preachers who drew on the Bible to declare slavery as immoral. These leaders also believed that slavery violated the idea of individual liberty. And during the 1830s and 1840s, the idea that slavery would die a natural death was no longer believed, as the textile mills accelerated American slavery. So there also, African Americans in the North also faced tremendous racial segregation and prejudice and discrimination because of legalized slavery in the South. So some key figures is William Lloyd Garrison. He established the Liberator in 1831, which was the most famous anti-slavery newspaper. And in that, he burned the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. He also 2 years later, he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, organized in Philadelphia, and for the next 3 decades, that society would campaign that slavery was illegal under natural law. Then Frederick Douglass wrote his narrative called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845, where which launched the public career of the most notable Black American spokesperson of the 19th century. He spoke publicly on the horrors of slavery, which was beatings, rapes, hangings, and killings, and he published his speeches in newspapers like the Liberator. He even had his own newspaper, which was called the North Star. Free Soil Party was organized to stop the expansion of slavery in southern territories, basically not just for moral reasons, but mainly economic, because free laborers cannot because people like white farmers cannot compete with free labor. Harriet Tubman escaped from the slavery, became a major conductor in the Underground Railroad at the time. Uncle Tom's Cabin was also released by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which basically intensified Northern sentiment against slavery, and it talked about the cruelty of the fugitive slave laws, and it really roused anti-slavery feelings among Northerners who did not agree with the responsibility of returning a human back to bondage in the South. And this isn't really in the period because it's 1853, which was after this period, but probably keep it in mind. Temperance, basically don't drink alcohol. It's a sin that causes the most crimes, poverty, insanity, broken families. And this indispensable to this movement were middle class and upper class women. As the moral protectors of the family, they pressured their husbands to take abstinence pledges and commit to it, and they raised their sons to abandon liquor and banished it from their households. Women's rights were inspired by the Great Awakening. Basically, when we were like, hey, we're advocating for all these different reform movements, but we don't have any rights to do anything. We can't even vote. So they believed that they were uniquely positioned in society to wage a moral war against social ills, and they called for many things, including suffrage, including higher education, greater access to professional work, not just manual labor in the textile mills. For example, in the Lowell Mill Girls were basically New England textile series, which employed young women, because they were cheaper. Basically, it was boarding, and they just worked a long time spinning mills and such. But, yeah. So, Seneca Falls, 1848 happened, where Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized this convention where women of all ages, and also some men, came and talked about the status of women. They drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically was modeled after the U.S. Constitution, and this was the first thing to start of the American American suffrage movement. And Susan B. Anthony was one of the most influential female suffragists of the time. She unflinchingly did things that were seen as inappropriate, but advanced the cause of women. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were daughters of a South Carolinian slaveholder who advocated for immediate emancipation of slaves. They also were famous crusaders for both women's rights and slaves. Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, the Supreme Court expanded its case a lot. All the way back to the Louisiana Purchase in the beginning of this period, we have Marbury versus Madison in 1803, which basically gave the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. In McCullough versus Maryland, we see the state of Maryland attempted to tax the Bank of the United States, and the Supreme Court found this unconstitutional and declared that federal law trumps state law. So that's all period 4. Period 5 is basically Civil War. So Manifest Destiny in period 5 is a term coined by newspaper article writer John Jonathan O'Sullivan. Let me see if I can actually. Yeah. Jonathan O'Sullivan, and basically it described America's God-given right to expand from like across from coast to coast, and also reinforced the idea of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant supremacy and the subsequent annexation of Texas and California from the Mexican-American War promoted white settlement and expansion of the U.S. and its policies further. Mormonism, John Smith, he was the founder of Mormons, and he believed to be a prophet and wrote the Book of Mormon in 1830 to transcribe his religious visions. But Missouri passed the Mormon extermination order in 1838, which forced the Mormons to migrate west to Utah. Another group was Shakers, who believed in Christianity, hard work, pacifism, and feminism. They had a strong work ethic, which allowed them to survive for quite some time. Transcendentalism was a social movement that influenced America, and it emphasized individuality, emotion over reason, and the glorification of nature. Basically, it's like nature is great, like God pervades nature. Two big figures were Ralph Waldo Emerson, who suggested that God could be found in nature and emphasized nonconformity, and Henry David Thoreau, who basically lived in a cabin alone for 2 years in Walden Pond in Massachusetts, and he chronicled the experience in his book Walden. Abolitionism basically condemned slavery as sinful, and they used revolutionary rhetoric to argue for the importance of personal liberty. Whigs adopted nativism. So nativism is a response to immigration. So we have Irish immigration from the potato crop famine. They largely settled in industrial ports like New York City and Boston, worked unskilled immigrant jobs. But Tammany Hall, New York, which is a large political machine, they were heavily influenced by Irish voters. German immigration came. Germanic states, they revolted or something, so displaced farmers came. They largely settled in like farms in old Northwest and frontier. And this led to the rise in nativism, which is protecting native-born rights over those of immigrants. So many were actually Catholics, which nativists hated. So this led to the creation of the Know Nothing Party, which was a group of American nativists who advocated for restriction on immigration throughout this period. They were an aggressive faction of Whigs who despised Catholics and foreigners. So another big thing is the Mexican-American War. But first, the U.S. wants to go trade with Asia. So that leads to the Treaty of Wangchia in 1844. 1844, and the Treaty of Kanagawa, where Millard Fillmore asked Japan to open trade with the U.S. So its goal was to promote trade between the two nations, and as a result, many Christian missionaries went to China to try and spread Christianity. So, Japan also opens up. So the U.S. wants to trade westward to Asia, and a lot of interest in territorial expansionism, economically, nationally, and there's claims of U.S. being racially and culturally superior, so they should spread this democracy, like they should spread this superiority to others. Belief in a manifest destiny, of course. So the Oregon Treaty of 1846 peacefully settled the U.S.-Canada border at the 49th parallel for Oregon. Basically, during the Polk's election, he campaigned for 54-40 threats of fighting. So, like 54 threats or fight, 54-40 or fight. So they wanted to go to the 54th parallel of the Oregon Territory and claim all of that. Thankfully, they settled for the 49th, and there was no fight needed against the British. And then Polk also campaigned on the fact that he was going to annex Texas. So since he won, John Tyler basically annexed Texas just as Polk was being elected, which creates beef with Mexico, which ultimately leads to the Mexican-American War. Also, Western expansionism. So the California gold rush is happening at this time, and that brings a lot of influx of settlers to the Bay Area, which leads to the rise of calls to bring California into the Union as a free state. So this is, again, going to promote slavery tensions, and Mormons are just expanding. They're just going west because of religious persecution. Mexican-American War. Basically, Mexico insisted After Mexican independence, Texas was super underpopulated, so Mexico was like, American settlers, you should come over here and settle and stuff. But then American settlers came and like they're kind of annoying. They brought slaves, even though Mexico had a banned slavery, and they just disrespected customs. So Mexico annulled the grant and were like, no more immigration. And settlers were mad at that, so they rebelled. And then Mexican dictator Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna defeated the Texans at the Battle of the Alamo. But Texans ultimately won their war for independence and became independent. And then when we annexed them, yeah, that happened. And then Mexico insisted that Texas' southern border was the Nueces River, but Polk asserted that it was further south on the Rio Grande. And Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor, who would later become president, to move his army toward the Rio Grande, across the territory claimed by Mexico. And basically, a Mexican army crossed the Rio Grande and killed 11 American Army patrol. And then Polk was like, oh my God, American blood shed on American soil. We have to fight Mexico. And Abraham Lincoln was actually like, kind of like, he was sus of this. He was like, he put forth his spot resolutions where he questioned exactly where the American blood had been shed on American soil. He personally opposed the war as he believed that it was fought solely for the greed of Mexican land. And conscience Whigs also opposed the war because of the expansion of slavery. And then the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ended the Mexican-American War and recognized the Rio Grande as the border, and also gave the U.S. California and New Mexico, as part of the Mexican cession, for $15 million. So that's a big chunk of land, right? That's a big chunk of land. The Wilmot Proviso, basically this happened as the Mexican War was starting. They were basically like, can we ban slavery in all the territories gained by the Mex-American War? And then the South was like, no way. And this basically emphasized tensions because it really intensified sectionalism, because this almost passed in the South. It almost passed in the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate. And then another big thing is the Austin Manifesto. So the Austin Manifesto was part of a secret plan to buy Cuba from Spain, like for the South, because they wanted more plantation land. They wanted to increase their power because they saw Mexican-American War would enter in a lot of free states, so they wanted to really increase their power. And this kind of got out, and anti-slavery members forced the President Pierce to drop the scheme of purchasing it. California Gold Rush, as I said, made California want to enter as a free state, but this really angered people, and this sparked talks of secession among the South. But thankfully, Henry Clay compromised 1850. He basically said California would enter as a free state. You would outlaw the slave trade in Washington, D.C. You would enact a new, much more strict fugitive slave law, and also use popular sovereignty in Utah and Mexico. And that the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically enacted the Compromise of 1850, and in effect, it repealed the Missouri Compromise because it said it allowed slavery because popular sovereignty, in places where previously the Missouri Compromise had not allowed it. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically, these territories were open to popular sovereignty, right? And this led to Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border. They're known as border ruffians, and they established a pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton, Kansas, and anti-slavery forces came, and they established their own legislature in Topeka. And this basically discredited popular sovereignty because Bleeding Kansas, there were a lot of fights to fight for is this territory going to be slavery or free, like voting. There are lots of illegal votes registered for that. Republican Party, made up of Northern Whigs, Free Soilers, anti-slavery. They were basically very anti-slavery, not just on moral grounds, but economically as well. And the Democratic Party split into Northern and Southern. Basically, Northern, Douglas was popular sovereignty, and South was that slavery should be protected in all territories. And election of 1856, James Buchanan is nominated or elected, showing that popular, it's really split sectionally, along state lines. Harper's Ferry, this crazy abolitionist, John Brown, he comes and kills he wants to start a federal raid raid of the federal arsenal and give the guns and weapons to the slaves and have them like rebel. But this plot was killed. He was hung and killed as well. This basically was like, it scared the South because it thought that the North was really coming to get them and their way of life. And John Brown became a martyr for the North. Dred Scott case, basically, this slave called Dred Scott, he sues for his freedom after living in a free territory. But the Scottish judge basically says that black people are not citizens and therefore cannot sue. And also, banning slavery is unconstitutional because slaves are property. And one of the amendments say that you cannot deprive people of their property. Lincoln Douglas debates were against Illinois senator position. And the debates basically were reflective of the tensions over slavery. Lincoln believed that the U.S. must choose whether to be slave or not slave, and Douglas believed in popular sovereignty. Election of 1860, Lincoln is elected without a single vote from any of the southern states, and the southern states immediately want to secede because they're like, oh boy, like, we are in a government where it's run by our enemies, so we'd rather secede and leave the Union. So 7 southern states seceded. South Carolina listed the immediate cause of secession as slavery, and also for states' rights and the belief that slavery must be protected. So they created the Confederacy, and the Confederate president was Jefferson Davis. The vice president was Alexander Stephens. Civil War. Most Americans believed that they were fighting to preserve the Union, and Southerners believed that they were fighting for states' rights to govern themselves. The South had many advantages, that they had very good generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. The North, however, had 4 times the population, a robust navy to embargo and control the seas and rivers, and they controlled a majority of the banks, railroads, manufacturing. One thing that happens were the New York City draft riots in 1863, which basically it allowed wealthy people, if you paid $300, you could duck out of the draft responsibilities, and this was unfair. People called it a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And then Battle of Fort Sumter was the first battle of the Civil War. First Battle of Bull Run shattered the notion that the war would be short and tidy, where Stonewall Jackson wiped the Union. But ultimately, the Union succeeded because of Ulysses S. Grant's leadership. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation shifted the purpose of the war from merely preserving the Union to fighting to abolish slavery. And then Sherman's march to the sea, he also marched from Atlanta to Savannah and basically burned stuff, destroyed railroads, and basically had a scorched earth policy. So yeah. And then at Potomac's house, Grant and Lee surrendered. The Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg Address, kind of unified the nation under the struggle against slavery as a fulfillment of America's founding principles. Then Reconstructions from 1865 to 1877. There's Lincoln's 10% plan, which dictated that 10% of Southerners must swear allegiance to the Union and accept the remaining. Let me see if I can find it. I haven't low-key been doing it, but yeah. Basically, 10% had to do Union and create a new legislature, in which they ratified the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves. And Lincoln wanted to be lenient and treat it as if the South had never left. Andrew Johnson took the presidency after Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. His vice president was unsympathetic to the emancipation cause and basically undid everything. Well, the Reconstruction plan was similar to Lincoln's, but it barred many of the former Southern elite from participating in government. But Johnson still pardoned many of the elites, and he allowed Old South legislators to implement black codes, which basically limited many of the freedmen's civil rights. Radical Republicans really wanted the South to pay, and they wanted to pass rights for free blacks in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau was created by Congress to provide educational, economic assistance to former slaves and also homeless whites, and it had military authority to resettle blacks on confiscated property, which thousands of blacks gained property this way. Black codes, basically, they adopted this code when Johnson became president, and they basically prevented blacks from renting land and forced them to sign labor contracts as vagrants. They were also prevented from testifying in court. And Johnson consistently vetoed bills that would assist black Americans in their assimilation to post-war Civil War society, which angered the radical Republicans. So they basically impeached him by finding him in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which basically says you can't fire a Congress official without Congress approval or something. And yeah, he almost got impeached, but it failed by 1 vote. and that basically rendered him politically impotent for the rest of his term. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment declared all people in the U.S. citizens, and 15th Amendment gave any male citizen the right to vote. So, some reasons why Reconstruction did fail was that Southern societies and economies didn't really change, and they basically replicated, after like the Reconstruction ended, it basically replicated the South economy again. Sharecropping replaced slavery, which basically was a process of renting out land to the poor so landowners can have workers and unemployed could have food and work and wages. And plantation owners had stores where free slaves bought seeds, fertilizers, tools, and even food and medicine on credit. And it reinforced the idea of system of servitude for former slaves, and they owned no land and became renters of property to former plantation owners. Hold on, I need to finish this. And unable to exit the cycle of debt. So basically, in effect, they were relegated to second-class citizenship. The Ku Klux Klan was a purpose to make sure that African Americans would not become equal through lynchings, intimidations, cross-burnings, and assassinations. And Klansmen often had connection with the local government, so blacks couldn't really do anything. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended Reconstruction. Basically, there was a contested election where both sides claimed that they won, like Democrats and Republicans. And basically, the Democrats succeeded. They were like, okay, Republican, you won. Like, B. Hayes, Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected on the condition of the Compromise of 1877, which required the end of the South's military occupation. So basically, during the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, the South was divided into 5 military bureaus, with a northern general in each one to enforce the laws. And basically, the Compromise of 1877 took those military out, and this basically allowed the Democrats to regain control of the South. And also, since the military was gone, no one really had to enforce the laws. So, yeah, that kind of marked the end of Reconstruction. So that was Unit 5. I'm not doing Unit 6 because this is already an hour, but thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.